Here in Chapter 6, we're going to cover some pretty interesting stuff and some stuff that you can directly apply to your academics or regular life if you'd like to. We're going to be talking about memory strategies and metacognition. So we talked last time about long-term memory and the way that information can get stored in long-term memory and how retrieval might work. Chapter 6 goes into a little bit more detail about how we remember things and some metacognitive processes that are pretty interesting to talk about. So it's kind of like thinking about your thinking, for example. There's a lot to go over, so we're going to get right into it. Again, you can always look back at the text for details or for clarification if something that you hear in the lecture isn't quite what you thought it was going to be. So by way of introductions, into the chapter, a lot of students report that they're not given a lot of information about how to increase memory for course material except for just to study, which, while is good advice, is not very precise advice. So we're going to talk today about some ways, or talk in this lecture about some ways that you can improve or increase your memory based on some actual strategies other than study. And one of the ways that you can do that is through metacognition, which is about how you measure or meter your own control with your cognitive processes related to memory and retrieval and making sure that you store information for retrieval, et cetera, et cetera. And also evaluating the strategies that you have. So it's not just evaluating how information goes in, it's evaluating the process that you came up with to put information into a storehouse. So let's start off with absent-mindedness and some strategies to avoid it. So again, this is kind of an applied chapter. It's kind of fun that way. Usually, absent-mindedness is when you forget something, and not only just because of attention, although it can be because of attention, but because something wasn't encoded in a highly effective way. So incomplete encoding, it can be attention, or it could be attention when you encode it, it could be attention when you're retrieving it, or it could just be the fact that you have something that you are trying to retrieve and you're really thoughtful about it and it just isn't coming up because you haven't found the right parallel distributed process in order to find it yet. So lots of reasons for absent-mindedness. One of the strategies that you can come up with is avoiding divided attention. And we've talked about this before, maybe in other lectures, but the idea of multitasking is not really a thing. We have selective attention that we can have, where we can select to pay attention to one thing or another. But that also requires you to know something about the task at hand and what to pay attention to. We also recognize that within working memory, there are real limits to working memory, and that can be a matter of how much information is presented or what information is presented or how fast it's presented. Whatever it is, there can be problems with rehearsal and encoding, and that can make getting information out particularly difficult. The good news is that we can rely on some other information that we already know about levels of processing to help recall. That is, rote rehearsal, just trying to flat out memorize things through repetition or some other weak strategy like that, can be helpful in very short burst ideas, especially if you're relying on the phonological loop to do it. We know that doesn't last long in your short-term memory, so it has a hard time getting processed. So if you can engage in levels of processing in order to encode information into long-term memory, then you'll have a lot easier time retrieving it. One of the ways that we've talked about is by using elaboration, remember. So if you think about what something means to you, as opposed to just learning like a spelling word, for example, you can think about what that word means to you or where you've seen it before, put it in a context, and that can help you. But if you're trying to remember information that's a little bit more detailed than just a spelling word, like you're trying to think of a social psychology construct, you can think about how that construct already relates to something that you already know, or you can use some why questions. You can use the self-reference effect, where you can refer to yourself when you're trying to remember the the information that you're trying to recall, the concept, for example, from social psychology. And remember that kind of leverages autobiographical memory as well. You can also think of how things are distinctive. So you can think about how an idea or a construct is different from another one, and that helps to create a different memory trace, or at least to have a compare and contrast kind of idea when you're retrieving information. That way you remember what the specific differences are. Again, using the self-reference effect can be helpful there to make things distinct. So for example, if you're trying to learn somebody's name and they have a name of somebody that you already know, then you can think of that person at the same time as the new person, and that'll help you remember their name. You just have to remember which person goes with which other person, but it's more helpful to do it that way than to just flat out to learn a name. And I've talked about this in classes before, where it gets increasingly more difficult as you go along to remember everybody's names, because every year there's more new people, so it can be difficult to remember the names, especially because the names tend to be relatively arbitrary. Very seldom is there like an iconicity about a name. So it's hard for names to be directly related to the individuals unless you have an associated meaning with it. So trying to develop an associated meaning can be helpful. And also remember that encoding specificity can be helpful. So if you're trying to learn some information and retrieve it, you want to learn it and retrieve it in the same environment. And if you can't do it in the same physical environment, you can think of something like a time of day or a mood that you're in or something like that, and try to keep those relatively similar. my deviant brain's like, yes, so if you know you're going to be really anxious about the test that you're going to take on the material, try to get yourself really anxious when you learn it. That way you'll have encoding specificity. That is probably not a good strategy, but it's where my weird mind went. You can probably relate to those kinds of asides. Two larger categories of memory strategies include how you practice, and that includes practicing in terms of encoding information and retrieval, and also the idea of mnemonics, about pairing ideas together with other existing ideas, and we'll look at some of those as well. The mnemonics come in different shapes and sizes. So overall, in terms of practice, quote unquote, or rehearsal, the total time hypothesis suggests that the more you study and devote to learning, and the more time you devote to learning, the better off you're going to be. I know that's not very exciting to hear, but that is the truth. The longer you do something, the better you are at it. And if you've ever had a job and you've gotten good at it, it's because you've been there for a while and you've learned, and you start to learn how to learn. And we talked a little bit earlier in the course about how as you learn to do something, you then use top-down learning to learn other things. That way you don't have to relearn every skill set you have. You have these transferable skills that you can then acquire other secondary skills or subordinate skills to without having to relearn the whole thing. And usually you learn it a lot faster and a lot better if you have a context for it. And that comes through time. So the total time hypothesis suggests that the more you study, the better off you are in terms of being able to encode and retrieve information. And that we found that study time can predict GPA. However, there's always asterisks to these studies. That's really only when the quality to study strategies is taken into account, not just the time altogether. For example, if you just read over a list of things over and over again, that's not going to be as helpful in terms of how long it takes you to do it as if you were to create some kind of mnemonic based on that. So study time plus quality of study can increase memory. We also have distributed practice effects, and this is where a lot of you guys jump off the bandwagon, because the major idea with the distributed practice effect is that if you spread out your learning over time, then you can learn better. But I know what you're thinking. I don't want to study any more than I have to. Okay, I agree, but the way that you study is going to influence what you can recall. In cramming for that test before you learn it, before you're asked to remember it, like the night before or whatever, is not an effective study strategy overall. You might be able to get past the test and everything, but if the goal is to pass the test and then not learn anything, then you're kind of missing the boat anyways, as far as academics is concerned. So you want to kind of space out your learning, because the mass learning effect is very problematic when it comes to cramming. You don't want to do that. And in the meantime, you do want to create these desirable difficulties. For example, sometimes you'll do like flashcards or quiz questions or something like that. Desirable difficulties stimulate and challenge your learning, so that you are forced then into digging into it a little bit deeper, and probably innately then using some of those skills that are related to levels of processing. So what you might accidentally be doing is creating opportunities for intrinsic recall, meaning that you might not remember what that exact word was, but you remember that it was on a particular flashcard, and if you fill in the blank, it'll kind of like pop into your memory. So in that way, you might accidentally be, by using desirable difficulties like flashcards, you might accidentally be leveraging other things like levels of processing. So again, that distributed practice effect, leveraging desirable difficulties can improve your strategies for learning to a great extent. Similar to that is a testing effect. Ugh, gross. Interestingly, one of the better ways to one of the better ways to boost long-term recall is by testing it. Okay? It's not just because you're motivated to learn it, although you are, but being tested on something forces you to create connections in the material. So it's not just you plug information in and it goes into these compartments. With test taking, you're kind of forced into retrieving it in a meaningful way, and that means you have to sort through information, and you're kind of accidentally, or naturally, I guess more optimistically, you're naturally creating critical connections between these things and having to distinguish between closely related terms and concepts. Some interesting research on the testing effect. What these researchers did was they had some students read essays and then test immediately after they've read the essays, or they delayed, and then they were asked to study again or to take a test. So what it looked like was one group was asked to study an essay 3 times in a row over a couple of time periods that varied based on what group you were in. And then one group was asked to read an essay and then take a test, and then read an essay, take a test. And in that way, they had a testing effect. The testing provided the practice in retrieving relevant material as opposed to just encoding it, because when we just study something and read it, we're not really practicing retrieval, which is one of the skills you have to develop to take a test. And again, what the testing does is it forces somebody to engage in desirable difficulty, and it also presents overconfidence. And we talk about that from time to time, that people get overconfident because they don't test themselves to kind of get a baseline for what they know. And we instinctively are overconfident. So this is the study design. This is a between subjects repeated measures test. So you have group 1, they studied, and then they studied again, and then they were asked to recall eventually. And then the other group was asked to study, and then they took a test, and then they were asked to recall after a certain period of time. And these are what the results look like. The blue group are the people that just studied altogether. So for the people who studied the essays, after 5 minutes, they recalled more than the people who did the study and then the test. Okay, that's a 5-minute recall rate. After 2 days only, so imagine that you study for a test on a Monday, but you study on Friday and take the weekend off. Studying and studying and studying, but never testing yourself actually has a diminishing return that's much greater than the diminishing return as if you were to study and then test yourself. So it's about a 68 or 69% recall rate after 2 days if you have studied and then tested. And then after 1 week, that same group that studied and tested is still up over 50% retrieval rate, but the group that only studied is down around 45% or so. So we recognize that the testing effect is strong, and it helps people to the big benefit of it is that it helps people to retrieve information as a way of kind of like practicing for the test, whereas people who only study never get the retrieval practice. And then also the people who are retrieving it, if they realize, oh crap, I'm not doing as well as I thought I was going to, then you can adjust your strategies a little bit more. But the people who only study, they get overconfident what they know because they don't test themselves to determine if they're doing well or not. Okay, and this is a recap of what we just talked about, so we'll skip that part. Moving on to a slightly different version of encoding is the idea of using mnemonics and mental imagery. So a mnemonic is a device that you can use to draw connections between elements, especially if you're trying to memorize them. And we can also use mental imagery in that same vein. Mental imagery is kind of being able to see something that isn't there. You can imagine something mentally, so something visual usually. One of the earlier experiments was ask people to come up with word pairs based on their ability to study them. And what it looked like was this. Each participant was asked to study this card for 1 minute on this task, just to look at it and just simply repeat the pair names in your heads, kind of, so it'd be like custard lumber, jail clown, envelope slipper, etc., etc. Get to tree ocean, and if you had more time, you go back over it again, just trying to remember it. That's just a study condition, no problem. Okay? And by the way, if you want to, stop and do it for about a minute. Then the next slide asks to fill in the blank. So if you see the word envelope, you look for you try to remember what envelope went with, and it would be a slipper, I guess. And then freckles is, I don't remember what it was. Let me see. I'm going to cheat and look. Apple. Okay, so you'd fill those in, and you would get some kind of success rate there. On the other hand, if you wanted to use a mnemonic using mental imagery, the question or the task would be look at these word pairs, and now what I want you to do, and they're different word pairs, by the way, what I want you to do is think of a picture in your mind's eye that combines soap and mermaid, football and lake, pencil and lettuce, and maybe stop the video here for about a minute and try to come up with those things. And then on the next slide, you can answer these questions. Fill in the blanks with the missing pair. And you'd probably do a much better job on this one than the last one. As a matter of fact, you might surprise yourself with how well you do by using mental imagery for it. By the way, some other mnemonics that you use kind of come up in different areas, like it used to be in biology, and I hear it's changed now just based on advances in science, that when you're looking at cellular division, it was DIPMAT, right? Diphase, interphase, prophase, telophase, anaphase, okay, whatever it is. I can't remember it all. But DIPMAT was the way that I remembered it. Or if you're thinking about like the stages of grief, right? So the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, DABDA, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So that's another kind of mnemonic, but these happen to be mental imagery with visual imagery. Mnemonics come in different kinds of flavors. The authors also supply kind of the keyword method for organizing this information that's new to you, especially. And in a keyword method, you identify some kind of word or idea in like a native language, for example, like if you're trying to learn a different language. And the authors supplied the example of the Nicaraguan word for turkey. It's pronounced champipe, but it looks like chom pipe. So they used the English words that they knew, chomp and pipe, put them together. As I know, it's CHOMPIPE, so it's not really chomp pipe, but it looks like it to them, so they used it. And that's valid. It's a valid way to learn something. It can be unique and niche for you, and that's not a problem. It doesn't have to be right. It just has to work for you. And now they see the word for turkey is champipe, and even though champipe sounds different than chompipe, the word looks similar, and that's close enough. That gets them all the way to turkey in Nicaraguan. Right. So there, that's another type of mnemonic. Another mnemonic you can use is something called the familiar locations method. So if you can associate items with locations, that can be particularly helpful. I compare that with the method of loci, also called memory palace. I'm not going to show it on this video, because if I play a YouTube video on a YouTube video, then I'll get copyright claim and it won't let me publish my video, so I have to ignore it. But the method of loci is very interesting in that this comes from like the Roman and Greek orators. They would have a speech to give, and they didn't have teleprompters, electricity and all. And they would give speeches, and what they would do is they would give their speeches while walking around an area, and a palace, for example, which is why the term memory palace kind of comes up. But you walk around as you're saying your as you're saying your oration, and you start to remember where you are when you're talking about certain aspects of it, so that when you're going to give your speech to a group of people, you can imagine walking through the palace or the area that you were going, and while you're rehearsing it, and then you can start to remember, oh, I was talking about this at that point. It kind of keeps you on track. And it can be highly effective. And we've done this too, by the way. Like if you're driving in the car listening to music, you might hear a song and you're singing, you remember where you are. And then, a month later, you hear that song come up again. You might think, oh, last time I heard this, I was driving, I was driving under the bridge right before I got off of my exit. So you might have that memory, and that's an example of how the method of loci works. Another mnemonic that you might be familiar with by term is called chunking. And we've talked about chunks before because we talked about the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. And one of the ways that you can increase short-term memory is by chunking information into smaller units. That way you can make sense of them. So in this example, the first line is YMCA, JFK, FBI, SAT, NBC, TV, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can't remember all those letters. But if we chunk them into more meaningful things, you can probably remember all those things. So, in all, how many letters? That's 4, 7, 10, 13, 16, 18 letters there. You probably couldn't remember 18 letters just strung in a row, but you could remember 6 chunks of things that are more meaningful to you than just the letters are. Now, not in all cases can we make chunks out of letters and make it be meaningful, but you might come up with your own abbreviation for what these mean. So maybe you could assign words to these and create a sentence out of them. So there are different ways that you could do that. Now, if you made sentences out of those, that wouldn't really be chunking so much. I guess in a way it is, but it's not like the strict definition of chunking in that way. Another way that you can use mnemonics is through organization. So if you're trying to remember a bunch of things, like animals, for example, let's say you're just trying to remember some animals that you saw at the zoo, you could use organization, and you could start to create this hierarchy in order to develop an organization system for what you saw. You have to kind of know what the hierarchy is, but in this case, I don't think that it's too tricky to recognize what all these things belong to. And if you saw a list of these animals, you could probably figure out what category they belong to. This is kind of also along the same lines of how taxonomy works in like biology and zoology. It's easier to remember what something belongs to if you understand what categories are available to you. The first letter technique is what I alluded to earlier when I was looking at the letters here. When I was looking at these letters, and I said you could make a sentence by taking the first letter of them, kind of like an initialism. That is the first letter technique, kind of like what we do with Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow. We also have Holmes for the names of the Great Lakes, so Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior, or the word news to help you remember what the directions are, north, east, west, and south. I remembered the directions by NESW, never eat soggy worms. I mean, I don't eat worms anyways, but definitely don't eat soggy ones. Even though we all kind of use these first letter techniques or initialism techniques, the effectiveness is not consistently demonstrated by research. Again, probably what you choose to use as an abbreviation is going to have more to do with your success at recall than the actual just flat out abbreviating it. So again, if you can implement levels of processing, the more likely you are to be able to recall the information. Another mnemonic technique is the narrative technique. So if you have to remember words, for example, or concepts or ideas, you could make a story that linked them together. So that's kind of what narrative means. In both retrieval and encoding, so learning and recall, as Bauer and Clark call it, you have stuff to make that list reasonably easy to remember. So think like a grocery list with 8 or 10 items on it. You could make a story about it, or you could come up with a pretend recipe, I guess, for the items that you're trying to remember. And if you can remember your silly recipe, or think about what you're trying to make or whatever, then you could recall that you need to get broccoli, eggs, soup, tomatoes, and cream cheese, whatever. That could be your soup. Extra credit to anybody who makes that soup and it tastes good. Let's shift gears a little bit. We're going to be going into the idea of prospective memory. And we're all familiar with retrospective memory. This is like what most people think of when they think of memory. It is that stuff that you remembered in the past. Prospective memory is a memory or remembering that you need to do something in the future. That's actually stored in memory. So if you know that you have to go to work today, that's prospective memory. It's memory for something that you have to do. You need to know that you have to do something and that there is content as well. So it's not just a matter of, oh, I have something to do in the future. You have to remember the thing, and also what makes it a little more challenging is that you don't have a context for it except for like work or whatever. There's nothing that you have done that provides context. It's what you will do that provides context. So prospective memory is more or less a verb type memory where you are trying to remember what you will do. You don't often have to remember what you'll remember, if that makes any sense. I hope it doesn't, because it's really not what we're talking about. So it really is about what you have done. Retrospective memory is more based on the ideas and thoughts and recollections and feelings about something that you have had. Now, that's not to say that you won't have a prospective memory that's based on sensation. Like you could have a physical imagery of going to the dentist. So I have to go to the dentist. Oh, I remember that it hurts. And you can have that kind of memory too. So prospective memory is not just strictly what you will do. It can also be linked to emotional memory. But it's mostly what you will do, the verb type of memory. In both cases, if you can use distinctive encoding and effective retrieval cues, so that level of processing, so using elaboration or chunking information if you need to, you're going to be able to have better recall for the memory that you have, and it's going to be more accurate. So not just remembering that you have to do something, but remembering details and being correct about those details. Also, and this is kind of obvious, I think, it's kind of one of those no-duh type things. Both types of memory are accurate if you have a short delay prior to retrieval, recall and retrieval, prior to retrieval. What that suggests is that there is something about processing that happens, and if you're not just cramming for something, that if you're letting information just kind of stew a little bit, and largely that's due to intrinsic memory. The idea that you can pull information that's not explicitly available to you, and you can do that by encoding across time. That allows you to consolidate information in memory. So just that cramming is just bad news in general, and it's been demonstrated for both prospective and retrospective memory. So again, some of the ways that you can improve prospective memory, we talked about mental imagery. You can think about, oh, where's my room? Oh, that's right. It's up there on the 3rd floor next to the big heater in the hallway. So you can think about where it is, and then you can remember where to go because you remember what your schedule is. And also distinctiveness. If you're trying to think about where your room is in the building, it's like, oh yeah, it's that building with the desks from 1964, right? You can think about the distinctiveness for something that isn't about all the other rooms. And in that way, you have a distinct prospective memory for the room you're going to be in, and you don't have to remember every little thing about the room, like the room number, right? You can probably even remember that it's on the 3rd floor next to the lab. So again, you can create distinctiveness. Think about prospective memory sometimes in terms of how you might give somebody directions. You don't just say, go to the corner and turn, right? You have to be distinct. Go to the corner of Cottage and Main Street and turn left. Is that even an intersection? I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know the streets around here because, again, my prospective memory includes mental imagery and not something that's based on encoding things by what they're called. You do it too, by the way. It's not just me, when you get directions by landmarks and stuff. Sorry, I'm getting off track. Some other ways that you can help to improve prospective memory using external memory aids, which could include something as obvious as a grocery list, right? That's pretty easy. Or putting, like sometimes I'll put my wedding ring on my other hand if I have to remember something. And most of the time it works where I remember what I was supposed to remember. Sometimes it makes me panic. So I'm like, crap, I don't know what I was supposed to remember now. But it can help. It's, like I said, none of these things are ironclad, but they can aid in your prospective memory. Aid does not mean it guarantees. My wife, who is always losing her keys, is guilty of not having a place to put things. So the external memory aid is that when she comes home, I have a basket that's by the door, and that reminds her to put her keys in the basket. The basket used to not be by the front door, but now it is, so that she can put her keys in there. So I lose stuff too, by the way, in case she ever hears this. It's not just her, I lose stuff too. I don't know why I'm so afraid of my wife all of a sudden. Well, I should, never mind. Again, I'm getting off track. The nature of the placement of the external memory aid can be helpful so that you can remember what to do with something. And again, like putting your keys in a basket, that seems to be very functional, but it still is a memory aid because you see the basket. Oh yeah, it jogs your prospective memory to do something. Okay. And again, the external memory aid is only as effective as it is easy to use. So try to make things easier on yourself. This next slide is available to you. You can take a screenshot or whatever. I'm not going to do much with it other than that. This is kind of a breakdown of ways that you can improve your memory using the strategies that we've talked about so far. So there you go. Screenshot it. Commit it to memory. There you go. Moving on, meta memory. Meta memory is a pretty cool thing. It really speaks to the way that you think about your own cognitive processing. We learned in a prior chapter that we can't know everything about our cognitive processes. We usually know more about the product of our cognition than we do the process of our cognition. So your metacognition is kind of like a supervisor. It helps you to think about the way that you're thinking, which sounds kind of inside out. But it's about like self-knowledge. It's about meta-comprehension. Like, how do you know that you know something? Or how do you know that you remembered something the right way? It's kind of like this executive that tells you how to pay attention to things. And we've talked about the executive orienting and the executive attention network several chapters ago. So you're kind of familiar with those things. So some of the kind of rhetorical questions that can help you think about A, metamemory in general, but B, what we're going to be talking about next, look like this. So what factors influence people's metamemory accuracy? So how can people trust that how they think is valid or that what they know about something is valid? What are people's beliefs about factors that might influence their memory? Right? Do people think that they remember better because they cram? Can they reflect on that? So what kind of beliefs do they have? What do people know about how to regulate their study strategy? So that's kind of that reflection piece. Do people know how to review a study strategy to know if it's beneficial? Do they know that taking a test over something creates a desirable difficulty compared to just studying over and over again? How accurate are people in knowing whether or not they'll remember a word? So again, it's this meta memory process is not how good are they about recalling a word, is how good are they in judging whether or not they could recall a specific word. Spoiler alert, we're overconfident. We are overconfident. We'll talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect as well. Okay. So when does your meta memory actually predict your actual memory performance? Well, let's take a look at an example. When you're estimating the accuracy for total score versus accuracy for individual items. So people tend to be overconfident if you ask them to predict your total score in a memory test. However, so we'll put it this way. If I ask somebody, how well are you going to do on this? They'll be like, I'm going to get an 80%. But if you ask people how they think they'll do on the individual items in a test, so not just the overall score, but how they think they'll do on individual items, they're actually pretty accurate. And there's a very interesting thing that goes in there, something called a foresight bias. So people will overestimate the number of answers that they will supply in a future test. So if they think that taking a test they're going to do really well on, they're probably engaging in the foresight bias, thinking that they are going to do better than they are going to do. And again, there are ways to help with that. And one of the main ways that you can help with the foresight bias is by having people study by taking a test, creating a desirable difficulty. The problem with this particular way of overestimating is that people usually study with the correct responses visible, whether it's doing flashcards that you have the answers just readily available, whether it's just having bits of information on a piece of paper you're trying to remember, whether it's reading a book, which is like the worst because, well, reading a book's the worst. No, that's not what I meant to say. It's what I said. It's not what I meant to say. What I mean to say is that as far as overestimating your accuracy of recall, it's the worst because when you read a book, the answers are not only there. That's all you're looking at is the answers. So if you read a book, all you're supplying yourself with the answers, and then you overestimate what you're going to know. So we try to conceal answers when we can to create those desirable difficulties. Now, the foresight bias is part of what's widely known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, and this is a really cool effect. What it suggests is that people tend to overestimate the scores they're going to get on some kind of test or measure early on, and usually before they're good at what they're getting tested on. Sometimes we call it beginner's luck, where people think that they're going to do better than they do, but that's not really the case. So in this particular test, what happened was that people took a test, and then they estimated what their score was going to be on the test after they finished it, before it was graded. The less competent students, so the students who actually scored less, overestimated their performance. And the top students actually underestimated their performance. So there is not just this linear foresight bias that we have. It depends on what you know about a certain topic. So the people who scored in the bottom 25%, their actual scores were much lower than their estimated scores. So there's a big gap here. And then as people got more competent, they realized what they knew and what they didn't know. And then the people in the second 25%, they only had a small drop, but it's still kind of meaningful. There's still a drop there. There's just a very small drop between the estimated scores of the people in the 75th percentile, or between the 50th and 75th percentile. And then the people who are the top in terms of competency on this test, they actually estimated that their scores would be lower. And what the Dunning-Kruger effect suggests is this, that when you know less about a topic, you overestimate what you know about it more. I'll say it again. When you know less about a topic, you overestimate more than those who know a lot about a topic. Now, they're going to know more about the topic, but the more you know, the more you know that you don't know. And we've all gotten into this before, where you take a class like Intro to Psychology, for example, and you're learning all this cool stuff, and like, wow, I know all this cool stuff. And then you talk about that cool stuff again in another class, and you're like, whoa, wait a second. The way that I learned this cool stuff was obviously a little bit different. You're correct, it was introductory. And now that you're learning it at an upper level, this is really hard. So all of a sudden, your overestimation as a bottom performer in like an Intro to Psych class in terms of the overall span of the material in the major, for example, is a lot greater than at the top. And at the top, you're like, you know what? I'm learning this stuff, but I'll bet there's a lot more to know about it. And you're right. So even people at the top need to have reasonable expectations about what their estimated performance will be compared to their actuals, but they're much better at bringing those two things into alignment. And it's really not until the top 25% of performers do you actually see this kind of chiasmus where we have a reasonable estimation of the performance compared to the actual performance. There is another error that people make when they estimate how well they did on something. And if you are going to test somebody on some material, just a vague test, whatever, on material, as soon as they hand in a paper and you ask them, how did you do? They're going to overestimate how they did compared to if you ask them after a delay. People reflect. They have an ability for metacognition to take hold. They can reflect on questions. They can think about it. They might have these epiphanies that, oh crap, I was wrong on something. But as soon as they're done with a measure, they overestimate how well they did. If you delay judgments, then they're usually more reasonable in predicting which items they'll recall. So if it's a test they took or if it's a list they're trying to remember, if you can delay your judgment on how well you did or how well you will do, it's usually going to be more accurate than if you just judged right away. One of the factors about memory that can affect whether or not you recall or how well you recall is how you allocate time when the task is easy. So a study showed that people kind of distribute their time studying when they study at their own pace. Usually what happened was that people would allocate more study time if they believed that if the material were more difficult to master. At the same time, we find that that students will spend a long time studying and giving more time and effort to the items that they already know, which is not necessarily ideal. The reality is that it's a failure of metacognition when people aren't able to regulate how they study. So it is important that you study the things that are more difficult to master, and we found that there's a high correlation of students that do that. But at the same time, you also need to focus on the material that is a little bit easier, so that you can still get those elements correct without having the foresight bias that suggests that you already know it. So it is important to spend time on both the stuff that you haven't mastered yet and the stuff that you have a good grasp on, just so you can get each one right. The reality is that it's difficult for students sometimes to accurately judge whether or not they're allocating time appropriately in any case. Now, allocating time when the task is difficult is another issue. When doing tasks that are exceedingly difficult, and we're still talking about kind of the student mentality of taking a test, let's say that you are taking a test and there are 10 questions on the test, and 2 questions are very difficult for you. Like, so let's say they're short answer essays. You don't really understand them all that well, and then the rest of the questions are still challenging, but certainly things you can grasp. People will oftentimes spend an inordinate amount of time on the difficult things, thinking that they have to focus on it, when in fact they they might have only a small proportion of the points allocated to them. So if 2 of the questions on a 10-question quiz, so 20% of the quiz is incredibly difficult and it's very hard for you to understand it and to be able to answer it like an essay format, sometimes it's better to not focus on those and then make sure that you get the other things correct. Because if you spend an inordinate amount of time on the difficult things, then you will be shorting yourself on time to focus on the other things that you would otherwise get full points on. So not only then will you have a hard time with the hard stuff, you won't have studied the other things in adequate depth and detail to get a good grade, even if you knew the hard stuff reasonably well. So when the task is difficult, sometimes you can choose to, as long as you have to weigh this against the number of points that this thing is on a test, for example. But sometimes you can weigh that out and determine that it might not be worth doing it or not studying as much for a particular item if it's going to cause you to neglect some of the other points that you would otherwise get. And the idea of completing less difficult tasks more than the more difficult tasks has been replicated in several other studies. You can see one here, other studies more. You can pause and read this if you want to. It's in the book too. I don't need to convince you of it anymore. Last couple things. I want to talk about the tip of the tongue and feeling of knowing effects. So we've all had the tip of the tongue effect. And that's kind of like this feeling like you know what you're trying to find, but you can't recall it. And also the feeling of knowing like, man, I know that, I just can't think of it right now. Both of those are failures of metacognition, failure to understand or to recall what you know, or just plainly to know what you know. And the tip of the tongue effect is interesting. If you're given the definition of an uncommon English word, you try to identify it. And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Sometimes it comes really quickly, but a lot of times it's that tip of the tongue. Be like, man, what is it? And sometimes you can think of it in like a motor sense, like, oh, it's like 3 syllables and it has like an A sound in it. Oh, what is it? So that kind of impact or that kind of effect is that metacognitive process. You can think about the word that you're trying to think of. You just can't find the word itself. This is especially difficult when the words or thing that you're trying to think of have the same kind of syllables as something that's near to it or has the same sound to it. This also is differential between bilinguals and monolinguals. Sometimes if a language has gender-specific endings, like Spanish, for example, that can be helpful in figuring out what you're trying to think of. I don't know Spanish, so I can't give a lot of examples. But the idea is that if you have a word that sounds like another word, but is the different gender, then it's probably not as likely to create a tip of the tongue phenomenon, because it wouldn't make sense semantically that it be one and not the other. Interestingly, and because it is a language, American Sign Language has a similar type of phenomenon called the tip of the finger effect, because you can have signs that are near to each other and try to think of, oh, wait, which one is that sign? And you kind of like, oh, I can't think of what the sign is if it's this one or this one. For example, in sign language, the sign for good and the sign for thank you are very similar, and you might kind of get confused about it. Same thing as the sign for please and the sign for sorry are very similar. The only difference is a closed hand. Or the sign for clean and the sign for slow are very similar. And it can be difficult to sort those out, especially if you're going at speed, just like trying to find the right word can be difficult if you're going at speed. The feeling of knowing effect is very similar to that, where sometimes you have a hard time predicting, it's not a hard time. You think that you can predict the answer to something. You know the answer, you just can't find it. And lots of times there's partial information, and you just can't think of what it might be. Some examples of that are just some common questions. Trying to think of, okay, what am I trying to think of? I know this, I just can't think of it. What is it? And some of these are you can see some of them from the textbook with the tip of the tongue phenomenon. But there's also this feeling of knowing. So like, what do you call a word or sentence that reads the same backward and forward, such as madam, I madam? That's called a palindrome. So sorry, pause it if you want to take a second. What's the name of the islands off the coast of Ecuador that Darwin visited to study unique species of animal life? Galapagos. What's the order of lower mammals, including kangaroos and opossums, which carry their young in an abdominal pouch? Remember? You don't remember? Should I tell you? Marsupials. What's the word meaning favoritism in hiring based on family relationships? Nepotism. What do you call a person who appeals to people's prejudices, making false claims and promises in order to gain power? It's a despot. And what are the people who makes maps? Tongue twister. We'll talk about that too. What are the people who make maps called? Cartographers. Right. So you may have known some of those. You may have had a hard time. Thinking of them. But once you heard them, you're like, oh yeah, I knew that. Maybe you didn't know all of them. By the way, I guess another answer for the second to last one, what do you call a person who appeals to people's prejudices, is a demagogue. Generally, the despots are more evil than that, but, probably the same type of person. So I'll points if you keep it with either. How about that? Okay, I lied. I want to talk about one more thing. Sorry. Boo for me. Metacomprehension, just real quick, and only because these examples pertain to college students in general. Metacomprehension are how you think about language and comprehension. So this is kind of a bummer, but it's true, and it's not because college students are inherently flawed, but college students just are not very accurate in metacomprehension skills. So they don't always know what they think they know, if that makes sense. They don't always process language effectively. Like college students lots of times will look for the gist of something and miss inconsistencies or missing information when they're reading something because they're looking for the basic idea. Another failure of metacomprehension is that students oftentimes think that they know something just because they're familiar with a topic as opposed to having specific information. There was a study that came out that was published in the APA Monitor, and the study suggested that there was a strong overestimation of what somebody knew about a topic and considered themselves, quote unquote, an expert. This was based on their qualitative research that people would classify themselves as experts if they had only read the title of an article. So they asked people to read the titles of articles and describe how much information they knew and how to classify themselves on it. And many of them classified themselves as experts just because they had read the title of something, not even because they were familiar with the topic or anything, just because they read the title. So in that same way, just being generally familiar with something is not good enough for recall and for learning. You actually have to know the stuff. So like reading the summary in the back of each chapter is not a helpful strategy because you will overestimate what you know. So yeah, read. Haha. Okay. I've had enough of this. Lots of fun. This is kind of an interesting chapter. Lots of cool stuff to go over. If you have any questions, as always, reach out. Hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I will see what you can do in the course room.